This is part 10 of Dawson, a series on the evolution of a fictional New England mill city utilizing real history. Last episode, we talked about the immigration of Somali refugees and the final death of urban renewal in Dawson. If you haven't listened to that, I recommend doing so. If you already have, or just like to listen out of order, then welcome to the finale. This is Dawson. This episode, I'd like to talk a little bit differently. Because even though the recurring themes throughout this series have certainly been relevant today, I feel like the issues in this episode are not represented enough and are still fresh. Compared to the other social themes on this series, racism and immigration, classes, etc., gentrification, as we know it, is a relatively new thing. Before we even begin talking about gentrification, I must define what I mean in this episode, because it's a bit of a loaded word. It means a whole bunch of different things to different people. So, I'd like to define what I mean by gentrification. I find that Wikipedia's definition is the best to what I want to convey. A process of changing the character of a neighborhood through the influx of more affluent residents and businesses. I prefer this definition because that includes all classes. It's not just turning a working class neighborhood to a middle class. It's also turning former slum areas into working class neighborhoods. Exactly what happened last episode in Lewiston. And even turning middle class neighborhoods into upper class. I like to think of it as Portland, Maine in the past few years. With something like this, it depends whether you're on the receiving end or the benefiting party. The word has negative connotations. But if you're gentrifying a neighborhood that used to have no residents in it, then it's not bad. So I'm not going to side and say it's either good or bad. Let's see what it looks like in Dawson. There's always a force behind gentrification. Sometimes it may be the municipal government, local institutions or organizations. Most of the time it's a combination. For instance, the driving force in the gentrification of Lewiston, Maine is a combination of all three, however. The way Lewiston has been gentrifying is what I like to call community-oriented gentrification, as opposed to developer-oriented gentrification. I see the two main forces of gentrification like this. Community-oriented gentrification being the community itself, local businesses, local money, local residents, local organizations. I think about what happened with the North Village in Boston. In the mid-20th century, this neighborhood in Boston was blacklisted. No banks outside of this neighborhood could give out loans and mortgages to businesses or people in this North Village. So, all the money that was made in the North Village stayed in the North Village. Over time, the neighborhood gentrified. But the thing is, no one lost their home because they were the ones gentrifying it. No one was moving out because everyone benefited. The residents made their own money, which again stayed in the neighborhood. Residents in the neighborhood got richer. Today, community-oriented gentrification is usually forced by the community. It's rare, and it's very, very slow. It may take decades before any noticeable effect shows. This method benefits the residents, and it's relatively stable once it's finished successfully. The other type of gentrification is what I call developer-oriented gentrification. This is the most popular form of gentrification and the type that a lot of people hate. Often, you can see it as developers buying up cheap buildings in poor neighborhoods, renovating them and selling, leasing, or renting them at a big profit. Other times you see it with new lifestyle centers, Whole Foods entertainment developments, or large-scale developments like Rock Row in Westbrook, Maine. Unfortunately for Dawson, the gentrification comes in the former, developer-oriented gentrification. For Dawson, it starts between 2005 and 2010. The local university, UMaine Dawson, has already started to sponsor art programs around the city so they can both expand the art program and beautify the neighborhoods. This doesn't start with the goal of gentrification, as it often doesn't, because humans need and desire beauty. It's a natural thing. You go see these beautiful cave paintings that were done long before ancient civilizations, and the people who did it were dying young. Current scholars guess that your chances of surviving childbirth was only 75%. To put that in perspective, today in the US it's about 99.98%. Why did prehistoric peoples make these cave paintings if this kind of stuff was going on? How could it have been that they were a necessity? I read that some of these paintings were used to document their expeditions, but that doesn't explain why some of these are so elaborate. So maybe art is an innate human need, the need to create. But I'm just speculating. That's the kind of luxury I have as a student and not a historian. This, what I'm calling a primal desire to create beauty, starts in Dawson with the need to make the neighborhood more colorful. Think about it like putting a new coat of paint on your house. A little color goes a long way. Along with the desire for beautification, the local government, with community support, proposed an intercity rail connection with Portland. In the past few decades, passenger rail has started to see a resurgence in the United States. In cities, an increase in neighborhood beauty and rise in mass transit often lead to a rise in land value. With this rising seen in the arts sponsored by UMD, the soon-to-open intercity rail line and the empty mills ripe for redevelopment, Dawson starts getting eyed by developers from more economically thriving areas like Boston and Portland. Several mills are redeveloped as housing, apartments, and offices. And slowly, Dawson starts to gentrify. Downtown apartment buildings, some of which we discussed earlier in this episode, were abandoned prior to the influx of refugees, are renovated. They then gentrified, if we're using our term, to make them at minimum livable for refugees. Then, a decade later, are gentrified for the middle class. Because this isn't the slow-moving, neighborhood-centric type of community-oriented gentrification, the current residents of the downtown neighborhood don't really get any benefit from the continued gentrification, and land values continue to rise and so does rent, forcing residents to move out of their apartments. As downtown continues to be less and less affordable, this pushes the working classes further and further away from the city center. Eventually, the only way any working class person making minimum wage can work in downtown Dawson is to travel far, whether it's by their own car, which counting gas, maintenance, parking, and insurance gets really expensive, or public transportation, like the intercity rail line. The local housing authority does build a few affordable housing units, but even then, with subsidized rent, the cost of living is difficult to balance in a place gentrified like this. And most of the people who live in these affordable housing units are not working class, but instead the lower middle class. As a result of this, both Stanford and White also gentrify, but not as much as downtown Dawson. While the gentrification occurs, the increasing amenities and attractive newly developed real estate become a magnet for tech and engineering companies to sprout up in Dawson. Through my research on the topic of gentrification, I found it difficult to find papers that don't portray it positively. I found that there's definitely a bias in academia on this topic. In March of 2008, when Chris Allen published an essay called Gentrification Research and the Academic Nobility in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. The abstract goes, quote, "This essay is a response to Tom Slater's article, The Eviction of Critical Perspectives from Gentrification Research. My essay addresses two issues. First, I consider the issue of why gentrification research appears to be losing its critical edge. I argue that social position infects understanding and inevitably, therefore, academic knowledge production. Thus, the social proximity of the academic nobility to gentrifiers and social distance between the academic nobility and the displaced has epistemological consequences, notably the lack of critical perspectives in gentrification research. Second, Slater's paper appears to be an appeal for more critical research from the academic nobility. Perhaps we should go even further. We should actually question the epistemic authority of the academic nobility, which claims its legitimacy to speak about gentrification on the grounds that it undertakes research on the phenomenon. There are strong and sound epistemological reasons for also listening to the marginalized voices of people that have first-hand, albeit not research, experience of the negative effects of gentrification." End quote. This essay was a very interesting read and provided a refreshing perspective. On the other hand, I found more information in news articles than I did in scholarly articles. Specifically, one about the gentrification of East Austin, Texas. This August 2015 journal, titled Crossing Over Sustainability, New Urbanism, and Gentrification in Austin, Texas, was written by lecturer Andrew M. Bush, says, quote, "The most deleterious outcome of gentrification is its effect on existing social cohesion, which is much more important for vulnerable and historically segregated neighborhoods of color, where residents have fewer relocation options and are more dependent on the neighborhood for social structure than are residents of middle-class neighborhoods. Poorer minorities are more vulnerable to rent hikes and increased costs, and are more dependent on place for community than wealthier groups. They also tend to understand community in terms of place, especially in historically segregated locations. Although gentrification is in some sense a function of market changes, political and economic disparities in the allocation of municipal capital undergird the relationship between gentrification and spatial justice in Austin. While the city uses public money to attract investment, subsidize more expensive development in East Austin, and generate tax revenue, it does not adequately invest to provide subsidies for affordable housing for long-term and disadvantaged neighborhood residents, many of whom have been forced out of central East Austin or have lost friends and family to displacement." End quote. More often than not today, gentrification manifests itself with neighborhood revitalization. I've also seen it referenced as urbanism. The article from above continues on, quote, "Middle-class consumers, developers, and planners view new urbanism as environmentally friendly architecture that reflects sustainable urban lifestyles. Longtime residents, most of whom are minorities and many of whom are economically disadvantaged, regard new urbanism as producing new urban spaces that undermine the sustainability of their neighborhoods. While the former group focuses on how the built landscape enhances sustainability by lessening pollution and energy use, and moving development away from the pristine natural areas, the latter group seeks to explain gentrification's deleterious socioeconomic effects on vulnerable populations." End quote. In the 2010s in Dawson, several new developments are built in downtown with the help of a program called Hope 6. Hope 6 is a program under the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development that provides funds for mixed-use developments. Mixed-use developments are a cornerstone concept in new urbanism, which is also called traditional neighborhood design. New urbanism is a response to the urban renewal and suburbanization of the decades after the Second World War. In stark contrast to the inefficient land use of traditional suburbs that promote car usage, new urbanism promotes denser development, just like what we've seen in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In addition, it also promotes streets with greenery and pedestrian-friendly spaces, and public transportation usage. Mixed-use developments are buildings with multiple types of zoning within them, like residential, retail, and office space. Most often, downtown mixed-use developments are retail zoning on floor level, with either residential, office, or a combination in the floors above. In Dawson, several of these developments are built using the Hope 6 program. I would like to cap off this series with a few words. Lewiston, Maine inspired my interest in urban planning. I look at the efforts the community is making toward community-oriented gentrification, and I am grateful. We are starting to rebrand ourselves and move away from our reputation that mill cities in New England have. We're providing quality, low-income housing and adding green spaces. As I look toward other cities close to me experiencing developer-oriented gentrification, like Biddeford, I get concerned. This is not to say that developers are bad. In fact, they are the force that is improving our cities, even in community-oriented gentrification. What's important is to not forget those who do the dirty work. What's important is to provide them with a livable community. If we throw them away, what do we have left but an empty shell of streets and buildings? Our cities are what we make of them. They appear to us as streets and buildings, but they are so much more than that. Cities are the people that live in the buildings and that drive on the streets. Without people, cities are empty shells. We need to treat our cities like ourselves and other people, parodying the old saying, "Do unto our cities as you would have them unto you." Because cities change as much as people do. We have to remember that our cities are not static things, but they are dynamic. They change constantly, even if they don't appear to. So I leave off with this. Be a part of your town, because that is what you are. You are a part of it as much as the streets and buildings are. Thank you for coming on this journey with me. Please consider subscribing for additional content and leave a like to show your support. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at the handle unnamedwithmatt and on Reddit in r/unnamednarrative. If you would like to get in touch with me directly, you can email me at unnamednarrative@gmail.com.